Disclaimer: opinions expressed are solely of those of the presenter and maybe mine, and not necessarily represent or reflect those of Pixel Dreams or its employees. Dr. D is going to control the presentation. I'm only going to talk a little bit at the beginning, and I might chime in here or there. Feel free to chat and add your questions or thoughts or anything you want to add in. I think this will be a much cooler and engaging and exciting discussion if you guys have questions. And yeah, let's get started. So this is a part of our INC series, this one specifically on prison reform. How do we make an impact on those in prison? And I am your host with the mostest, and we got Dr. Christopher DiCarlo as our presenter. A little intro, what is INC for those who don't know? INC, these are two letters that represent our company purpose, and our company's purpose is to increase intelligence and consciousness. A little bit about Dr. DiCarlo. So today's presentation will be led by our in-house critical thinking advisor, Dr. D. The doc specializes in philosophy, critical thinking, also known as CT, and cognitive behavioral therapy, which is something that we learned about a few of us in our leadership team a couple of years ago. He's written several books on the subject of critical thinking, including his latest, So You Think You Can Think, Tools for Having Intelligent Conversations and Getting Along. The doc has won several awards for Best Lecturer. He's taught at Harvard, U of T, U of G, Laurier, and Ryerson. I just wanted to make sure everyone knows he is a crazy, eclectic kind of guy. He's also a drummer. He's gotten a lot of praise for his work in critical thinking, including tons from Steven Pinker. And we are extremely proud and very grateful to have him on our team. And he helps us navigate through our critical thinking and philosophical journeys. And on to you, sir.
Thank you, Kel. All right, so here's the itinerary for today. We're going to have a bit of an intro, look at the current scenario, consider incarceration, mental health, personal testimonies, how we might be able to make a difference, and how much time and energy this might consume in so doing. So there's some opening questions Cal wanted us to consider in terms of prison reform. You know, what can we do? What can be done? How would we lower recidivism rates in prisons? How do we prepare inmates for life outside of the bars? What do we currently know about the prison system? What is the current scenario? How could PD, or anybody for that matter, make a difference? What resources are needed in order to help with this? And then how much time and energy would this require? So here's a quick introduction. What do we currently know, right? There's a distinction that we need to realize. Some people say, oh, that person's in jail. Oh, they're in prison. Really, jails are places where people are held pending trials, whereas the prisons and penitentiaries are where people actually do their time. They serve their time once convicted of a crime. And there's divisions between the various systems at both the provincial and federal levels. So anybody who receives a sentence of 24 months or greater serves their sentence in a federal correctional facility by the CSC, or Correctional Service of Canada. This is known commonly as 2 years plus a day. If you're convicted of 2 years plus a day, you're going to what they used to call the big house. Any offender receiving less than 24 months, known as 2 years less a day, or they're incarcerated while awaiting trial or sentence, they have their sentence in a provincial correctional facility. Now there's minimum, medium, and maximum security levels. Minimum, basically an institution where the perimeter is defined, but there's no real walls or fences, no armed correctional officers, towers, razor wire, any of that kind of stuff. Restrictions on movement are minimal, and inmates are generally nonviolent, pose very little threat to the safety of the community, and are usually on work release programs that allow them to hold jobs during the day. I don't know if you folks have ever seen the movie Elf, in which Will Ferrell's character is working in the mail room, and he's next to a kind of shady looking character, and he says, "Why are you here?" And he says, "Work release." And so we know that he's basically out doing some service for the community.
Hey, Doc,
So
can we consider a lot of white-collar crime under minimum security levels?
To some degree, yeah. You know, they call them the Hilton, right? Sometimes they refer to it as the Hilton. It's kind of you don't really have cells, you have rooms, essentially, that you stay in.
Which is also a pretty big dilemma, moral dilemma, when you have somebody put in jail for 10, 15 years, for example, in the US for small possession of marijuana, but you have white-collar crime that, yeah, steals from hundreds of thousands of poor families.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you ever want to brush up on, like we're talking about prison reform in Canada, but in the States, it's far worse. It might be amongst the worst in the world. Watch John Oliver's special on minimum sentences if you ever get the chance. You will have a difficult time believing why some of these guys are doing time, and I mean for life, and with no hope of parole. It's it's absolutely absurd.
That was partly part of the 3 strikes you're out.
That's Clinton. Yeah.
Yeah, the Clinton days. That's right.
Yeah, absolutely ridiculous. Much reform needed in the States. So in medium security levels, they're surrounded by chain link fences, often topped with razor wire. Firearms are present, but they're usually not carried by guards. So in this case, inmates are considered to pose a risk to the safety of the community, and they're contained in this environment which promotes and tests socially acceptable behavior. By the way, this is very clinical. This is actually from Corrections Services Canada. Inmates are expected to act responsibly under basically regular and direct supervision, participate in various programs and that sort of thing. And they have training centers and a variety of educational and treatment centers. Fewer today than there were, say, in the 70s and 80s, but they still exist nonetheless.
Why do you think there's fewer today?
Money. I think it's just the funding has been cut. And when Harper was in, he wanted to do these mega jails. Do you remember that?
Yep, I remember that.
And so a lot of money got shifted around. A lot of programs got canceled. So unfortunately, the prisoners are the one who feel the brunt of that.
Yeah. I know we're going a little off topic already, but does Canada have a issue like I know the US has with regards to profit, prison and profit?
Not yet. And I say that, not yet. We've been privatizing a lot, and it's usually conservative governments that do that sort of thing, right? So we'll see. We'll see if Canada starts using that US model for incarceration. But as of yet, no, I think we're still okay. So maximum security, surrounded by very high fences, 20 feet, guard towers in strategic positions, electronic systems ensure any movement within the perimeter is detected. They have firearms, they carry guns, and there's locked caches of firearms within the institutions in the event of a serious disturbance or a riot. There's locked gates, fences, walls. These tend to limit inmate movement and association. Privileges can be controlled, depending on the environment, the level of hostility that might be occurring at any given time. Inmates are expected to interact effectively with other individuals and highly structured groups, educational and treatment programs, skills development programs, a lot of which, by the way, are voluntary. Some inmates live in segregated units, although Canada has just outlawed basically isolating prisoners because it's considered inhumane. Solitary confinement.
How long ago?
Just recently, like within the last few months.
Oh shit.
Yeah.
So we were okay with solitary confinement up to just recently, like a few months ago. Oh,
that's right.
That's surprising.
It took a lot of lobbying to get them to realize it's inhumane. And, sometimes being alone is a great thing when you've got autonomy of movement. Sometimes being alone in an 8x8 cell, not a great thing. It really messes with a person's mind, and we feel has been considered inhumane treatment for years. Many of you will be too young to remember a movie called Cool Hand Luke with Paul Newman, but they talk about a night in the box. You'll spend a night for everything you do wrong, you'll spend a night in the box. And that's this holding center of isolation that's super hot during the day and super cold during the night. And it was feared by prisoners. You did not want to spend any time in that solitary confinement. So many of you will know of the John Howard Society. These folks have been around. They have places in various provinces throughout Canada, the US, Europe, other parts of the world. And they're basically about prison reform. They think that the longer prison sentences are not affected, not effective for rehabilitation, nor in reducing crime. There's been no real statistical significance to show either of these. And so they support appropriate use of community-based sanctions, gradual release, prevention, focus, progress. So putting the money in being proactive rather than reactive. Stephen Harper was all about reactive. These criminals are doing this. Gosh, we got to do that to them. And it's like, no, you got to understand the psychology of crime. You have to understand the reality of why crime exists in the first place. Why are there rule breakers, right? Why can't some people, just stay within the law? Well, it's a complex, multi-layered, extremely nuanced issue that requires great attention, great focus, and great scholarship. So through their Center of Research, the John Howard Society of Ontario looks at various findings within studies, and then they try to lobby to have these affect policy development. And then they have program evaluations because we want measurable outcomes. We want to know that certain things are working while other things are not. And that's the best way to treat human beings or any species for that matter. So that's the basic background of what's going on in the prison systems, the types of basic facts that we need to know. What's happening now, I looked at several annual reports. So Corrections and Conditional Release Statistical Overview, so Public Safety Canada. We have the performance report of the National Parole Board and StatsCan on adult and youth court statistics. These cover various cases across Canada. In terms of custody, here's some numbers you'll find interesting. So about 39,000 adults are now in custody on an average day between 2017 and 2018. You'll notice in some of these stats, the figures are from years, maybe 10 years ago. And the reason why is because in some cases, it takes that long to accumulate and acquire the information and then report it. Others are more current. So 131 per 100,000 people in Canada. This is actually down 9% from just 4 years earlier. So there are basically three groups. You have about 14,000 people in federal penitentiaries. You have 10,000 or so in provincial. But look at the number in jails, folks. 15,000. These are people just kind of waiting it out, waiting to have a trial. In the US, it's a little different than Canada. If you can't afford bail, you just stay in prison. And later on during the Q&A, I can tell you about a time I spent in Georgia in Macon County, where I was given the option of paying a speeding fine or staying in jail 28 days until my trial. And if I couldn't pay it, that's essentially where I was going to stay. So we have quite a few people in prisons at the moment, but not as much as you would think. The youth incarceration rate is quite a bit lower, 40 per 100,000, and a drop of 12% from the year before. That's quite surprising. This is not, there's an Indigenous over-representation. It appears to be getting worse rather than better. So about 30% of admissions compared to 4% of the Canadian population. So that's quite a stark difference. About a decade ago, Indigenous people accounted for about 20% of admissions to custody. So there's been a pretty dramatic deterioration over that time. Youth, pretty much just as bad. About nearly half of all youth admissions, even though 8% of the total youth population. Now, we can look into that. I mean, that's something we could focus on. It is an aspect. Why is that happening? What are the causal factors for that? Why is it skewed in that direction? Cost, you'd be surprised exactly how much it costs to keep people in prison. It's been getting steadily more expensive, risen by 7% from 2017, 2018 to more than $5 billion a year. And this is the breakdown. So if you're wondering how much it costs to keep a prisoner per day, that's $233. So $85,000 a year to keep a prisoner in the provincial systems. Look at what it is for federal. $130,000 a year we're spending to keep a person in prison, or $330 a day. So then we can ask ourselves, is this the best use of our money? Is this the best way we can serve the community, the best way we can serve society?
One of the things that you and I talked about in our first round was that the prison system and penitentiary system is based on the penal system. It's based on guilt and punishment. It's not based on reform and rehabilitation. It's not really designed to produce optimal results. It's produced to the result is punishment, really.
Yeah.
And the amount of money, I mean, you think for $130,000 a year, what could you possibly do to rehabilitate someone? So when that person comes out of prison, they're actually doing better than they went in, which is right now quite the contrary. And this is something that we also talked about. I think it's in some of the testimonials later where, and I've heard this as well as those from those who have gone into jail or gone into prison, where it's more of a criminal university. You go there,
yes,
to learn more about crime.
That's right. Like, wouldn't it be an interesting thought experiment? So you arrest somebody and it's like, you know what? We're not going to put you in prison for 10 years. We're going to give you 130 grand a year, and just watch what, you know, the person now has a place to live. They have steady diet, right? Like, would it just change their lives if we just gave them that money as an experiment and just saw how they turned out rather than going through a prison system, right?
You know, a lot of times policies are, and not a lot, but almost always, policies are biased, right? We make decisions based on bias. This is why we asked you to come join us on our team, so we can minimize our bias. When we talk about policy, it's typically very political. It's either left-leaning or it's right-leaning, right?
Right.
On the right-hand side, it's all about money and economics. On the left-hand side, it's about, you know, human rights. When I look at these numbers, I see a massive opportunity for a solution that people can join together. Look, you're spending $130,000 on this person. Forget about 130. What could you do if you spent $60,000? That's what, $5,000 a month, right? What kind of change if you did absolutely nothing, as you said, and just gave this person, the criminal, $5,000 a month to figure out how to rehabilitate him or herself? What kind of result would we get? From a right-leaning perspective, from a conservative-leaning perspective, we're looking at the economics. We're already saving half the amount of money.
That's right.
And from and that's not even including the opportunity cost of, like, how is this person actually going to be benefiting the economy?
Yeah.
Once they figure things out.
Yeah. And even more, Cal, you take the other half of that money, you hire a person who's a system navigator who helps that person. You know what I mean? They're their caseworker. And, you know, so they help them navigate through these various systems. If it's addictions, or if it's based on economics, or for, you know, whatever reasons are contributing to causing crime within that person's life, that caseworker then could help that person navigate through various systems, so that once they're out of a cycle of crime, then, you know, we've already been proactive in disallowing that from occurring and causing the rate of recidivism, or the, you know, the turnstile kind of crime system that we're now seeing.
Well, if we were to take a proactive approach and take a look at, say, at youth risks in lower income neighborhoods, and for $20,000 a year per youth, or per community, you know, you were to put $20,000 in a community center in say a certain area of town, that in itself would decrease the cost,
right?
Like exponentially almost.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, we could be putting our money to better use. There's no question about that. All right, so what are the stats for the most recent years? Now we've got 45,838. Adult incarceration rate is actually down from 2016, 2017. And in remand, you know, pretrial detention, the rate of those in remand was significantly higher. at 52 to 100,000, while those sentenced in prison, 35 to 100,000. So we have more people, it seems, waiting trial in jails in this kind of capacity than we do in the actual incarceration systems of prisons.
Doc, can you talk to us a little bit about the strategy behind why we keep people waiting for a trial in jail and how that differs between someone wealthy who can afford bail and someone who's not wealthy?
It's complex. When it involves mental health, the theory is during the 60s, we got rid of the concept and the idea of insane asylums where we could commit somebody. President Kennedy got rid of that, and our country followed suit. What that did then is it pushed a lot of mental health people out onto the streets. And so on the one hand, that was a very noble thing to do, and caring and compassion and whatnot, but they didn't have the infrastructure ready to look after these people. They didn't have the housing, they didn't have the quality of care necessary for this flood of people that were being basically let out of these so-called insane asylums for their own rights. So the problem has been trickling down literally since the 60s, where we still don't have enough infrastructure to treat these people. So that's one aspect of it, the mental health aspect of it. Others, folks, I don't know what your situation is in terms of knowing people who have done time, but the people that I've known who have done time, they're not necessarily lifers, but they have done time. For some of them, it's kind of a cycle of life. When they're without housing, when they're without a job, when they can't get a decent meal or whatnot, they'll commit misdemeanor crimes. When added to their file, their record already puts them back into these holding centers where they get 3 squares a meal and a roof over their head. Now, for us, that might seem horrific, but when you're out on the streets and you've got nowhere else to go, and if you don't think you can get drugs in prison, you're crazy. That just becomes a viable option. And I mean, that's a sad testament to any country's prison system, but that is the reality of it. And that's something we have to look at boldly in the face, right? So
basically, it's cheaper to get yourself into prison, and get a meal and get a place to sleep than it is to find a social program that'll help you with the welfare and housing.
Yeah, and they're falling through the cracks, essentially. Yeah. Average age, roughly the same for men and women. For a person incarcerated in Canada, age 33. Aboriginal inmates, 29. Age at admission of federal prisons is increasing. So 12.1% of the federal incarcerated population is over 50, compared to 8.1 back in 2001, 2002. Yes. This I find to be the most striking figure that our research has been able to find. 65% of people entering prisons have less than a grade 8 education or level of literary skills. 79% entering prisons don't have their high school diploma. Now, I don't want to go correlation to causation here, but this does seem to be fairly telling. And this has been cross-referenced that this is a definite factor in determining those who will be most likely to be incarcerated. Up to 30% reduction in recidivism can be achieved through programming depending on the level of literacy the prisoner achieves. So if Pixel Dreams is thinking about doing something, maybe the capacity for increasing literacy within prisons might be the way to go. That's something to keep in mind right now. Here's the mental health levels in 2007, 2008. Look at how low they are, 11.1. Now, you got to understand something about how stats were gathered in 2007, 2008. No prisoner, or very few prisoners, I can only speak for males, when they're given a survey, when they're asked about their mental health, will lie. They still look at mental health as a stigma and a weakness and will not admit it. And so the results are going to be skewed. It wasn't 11.1% in 2007, 2008.
Well, one of the things that you and I talk about often is we all have mental health challenges, just in varying degrees.
Yeah, exactly. And when that's compounded with other systemic issues, so education, economics, health, all sorts of various systems interlocking, you know, it really pushes people or nudges them in the direction of crime. 6.1% had outpatient services, 30.1 female prisoners previously hospitalized for psychiatric reasons. This may be more telling on a gender basis, that perhaps women are more open to discussing mental health issues, or at least they were in 2007, 2008 than men were. So this might be something to consider in terms of the way in which gender plays a factor. 14.5% male prisoners previously hospitalized for psychiatric reasons. So this basically comes from the CSC strategies. Federal prisoners prescribed for medical psychiatric concerns. Again, this goes back to 98, 99. Up almost double shortly thereafter. And you can easily double that again now for 2017, 2018. Female prisoners twice as likely as male prisoners to have a mental health diagnosis at the time of admission. And so I put hysteria there as a tongue-in-cheek joke. Why? Why? What is the different? What are we doing differently in terms of assessments with males and females? It'd be interesting to see those side by side. Are they the exact same assessment strategies? We would have to take a look at that. What are the frequent complaints, right? 28.3 of all complaints, right? Healthcare, conditions of confinement, basically cell property. You don't have enough room, or that not enough space. Here's the deaths, 533, 376. So that's, again, between 99 and 2009. This is quite surprising. This is the average for Canadians. Look at what it is in prisons. Strikingly higher. Okay, so it's not a great place to be. It doesn't seem to be a great place for receiving suicidal counseling. I'm sure correctional services is doing what they can given their budgets and whatnot. These are not necessarily cold, distant people, although some have been. But the fact of the matter is, that's a noticeable difference. Like, that's a clear difference between the average population. Rates of recidivism. Definition: a return to provincial correctional supervision on a new conviction within 2 years of completing either probation or parole within 6 months. Some provincial inmates, community supervision, they tend to go on to reoffend after release. Look at this. This is very interesting. So from 2001 to 2015, 2016, there seems to be a noticeable drop, right? Whereas the community supervision stays relatively the same. So my question is, what's going on? Has this changed? Has community supervision changed to bring about a fairly noticeable decrease in the rates of recidivism? This is very interesting. Another thing PD might want to look into is why. What's going on here? Who's at the helm? Here's the current scenario. There are various factors, obviously, associated with reoffending. Antisocial attitudes, peers, antisocial personality pattern, antisocial behavior, family, marital factors, education, employment, lack of pro-social leisure activity, substance abuse. And you can read more about that. We'll make these slides available if anybody wants to take a deeper dive on some of these issues. So that's some of the factors associated with why people reoffend. Let's look specifically at criminalizing people with mental health. So about 4 to 7 times more common in prison than in the community. I would argue it's even higher than that, given the current state of our prison systems. So why, right? Why are there more people? Well, as I had mentioned, in the 60s, the old system, the one flew over the cuckoo's nest system, was done with, and people were given greater rights, greater autonomy. In order to be incarcerated now, a person has to be formed. They don't necessarily have to be committed. That term is long gone. People can now be formed, but that itself is only a 72-hour time period in which they are released right after that, unless they demonstrate serious or egregious potential for harm to themselves or others.
Can you tell us what committed means? Because I think that's a pretty interesting definition.
Back in the 60s and prior to that, if Aunt Eloise was acting a little wonky, you could have her committed. You could literally say, this woman is not of sound mind, and an ambulance will show up and take her away. And we'll hold her until they decide it's safe to release her. So, you know, there's all kinds of horror stories about how people had been treated. You can conspire against somebody, you can gaslight people, make them think that they're acting one way when in fact they're acting another way. And so this would often be used to just get rid of people within various types of family, or the homeless, or any other aspect of society where people considered untoward or different from the status quo of the mass population could be committed and literally put away in an asylum and kept there until it was decided that they could be released. So the Kennedy government and Canada agreed this is inhumane. You shouldn't be able to take away a person's autonomy, because too many people were being taken advantage of in this way. That's great. That's a great bonus for human rights in that respect. But okay, now with those facing serious mental health concerns, how are we going to help them now? So they usually get shipped off to hospitals, and hospitals are overflowing as it is, and they're limited in what they can do. There are agencies throughout Canada where people can go, but they have waiting lists for months. So we are woefully underfunded with mental health care in this country. I am hopeful that post-COVID, a lot more money and a lot more attention will be given towards mental health and the care of those suffering from mental health conditions. So the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto has provided a number of reasons for why there's an overrepresentation of people with mental health issues in prisons. Basically, associated problems associated with offending, also related to increased risk of suffering serious mental illness. So people with problems of criminal behavior may in fact have mental illness, but the illness is not necessarily the cause of their criminality. It's an effect. It's a kind of a phenomenon that arises and complicates it. Getting tough on crime. More people from communities with various types of challenges will be incarcerated, and therefore overrepresenting those with mental illness. So people who don't have jobs or financially are struggling, living on the street, dependent upon social assistance and so on. And then there are symptoms of mental illness that can cause criminal offenses, right? So those afflicted with things like schizophrenia and various forms of neuroses can be, paranoid, they can be delusional, they can be irritable, have, manic episodes, grandiose, delusions of grandeur, various types of behavior. And, often the police recognize the problem as a mental health one. They will call for backup. If the offending is serious, however, criminal charges will follow. So it doesn't matter if you have a mental health issue. If you've killed somebody, you still will fall within the parameters of the law for criminality. Now, that may be a factor in considering sentencing, but you will still be taken out of society because you have proven to be a threat to others.
With regards to sentencing, how does Canada and the US fare differently compared to, say, some of the Scandinavian countries, and how they manage their criminals, especially those who have who have been identified with having mental illnesses of sorts.
Well, yeah, no, Norway and Denmark, they're incredible how they handle their prisoners. Not only do they set them up in a way that treats them humanely, but basically they are educated, they are trained, and when they leave, they can continue on with their training and go and get a position of employment within that particular field. So it's quite different. This is known as a wraparound service, which means once they take them in, they wrap it around all of the services, all of the systems are in place to wrap them around. So when they leave, they've served their time, they're welcomed back into society, and they're given greater hope for a better future. Plus, they treat those with addiction issues far better than the United States does, where it's not seen so much as a crime and something in which these people, have chosen to do and therefore are bad, a blotch on society. They're seen with more compassion, with a much more compassionate eye. And those are the models maybe Pixel will want to look at in terms of who's doing this right or who's doing this at least better than others. So here's what CAMH says we can do about it. First, right, we shouldn't be afraid of these people. They more than not present no real increased risk to themselves or others. And, these things should be available. And, there should be support. The family should be involved. We should obviously be well-resourced, which is going to be a government initiative. And we have to reduce, obviously, the stigma around mental health and reduce the symptoms of their illness. And in turn, this will all make society safer. Well, that's a very good point. Second, they want to prevent people from being involved in the criminal justice system in a cycling fashion. How do you do that? You give them a place to live. You give them an income. You give them 3 squares a day, which is what they were getting in prison, right? And drug abuse has to be addressed. I mean, it just simply has to be addressed honestly and without bias.
Well, it's ironic that at $130,000 a year, you just couldn't identify one who is, prone to criminality and deserves to be in jail, perhaps. And I use the word deserve very lightly. You and I share the same belief with regards to that concept of guilt. But those who are identified as having mental health challenges or addiction issues, that money could just go towards rehabilitation, right?
That's right. That's right. And proactive programs rather than these kind of after the fact, reactive programs. They mention that when someone with mental illness gets involved in this criminal justice system, CAMH and others have a responsibility to provide them with care and support. We know what's going on with the police right now, defund the police, get rid of the police and that kind of thing. Why has this been pushed onto the police? They've just been given more things to do.
Yeah.
And why? Because we're not funding mental health programs as much as we should be. That's one of the problems.
Another challenge with the defunding of the police that I've seen compared to how, say, Scandinavian or European countries manage their police, it's not really about defunding the police, but perhaps funding them more and putting that money towards educating them and equipping them and getting. It could be argued that some of the people who are in the police forces themselves have mental health challenges, and so you have people who are desperate or in small towns or counties that are desperate for a job. They're either going to criminality or they're aggressive police officers. And now you're putting them against each other.
Right. Yeah, instead of defund, maybe the right word might be reallocate. Like we need to figure out how best to use the money to limit what police are now being asked to do and get greater education for the police and have them work in consort with psychiatric teams so that their position is more of one of, if this situation goes south, they're the muscle we can rely on. And if it doesn't go south, they're just our backup waiting while the psychiatric team goes in and deals with the situation. So we'll see. We'll see what happens over the next few years. Should people with mental health issues enter the correctional system? three things. You got to screen, right? You got to find out who is afflicted with mental health issues. You have to have the care ready that is appropriate for them. Many of them are off their meds. Many of them can't afford their meds. Many of them have no drug programs. They might be on their meds someday and not on the meds other days. They might sell their meds. They might lose their meds. You know, to assume a person with a mental health issue, this is my biggest laugh in the mental health field, is hearing a psychiatrist deal with a mental health patient and then say, okay, I'm going to prescribe this. Here you go. Okay, now you have to go off all the other drugs that you're using. Are you out of your mind? You think this person's going to stop drinking, stop smoking dope, stop taking various drugs and whatnot? No, they're not. And it raises an interesting question. Should Johnson & Johnson and Pfizer and these major drug companies put some serious thought into developing drugs that actually work in consort with the drugs these people are going to be using anyhow? You know what I mean? Can you make antipsychotics that work when a person takes other drugs or happen to be an alcoholic? Because they often have mismatching side effects, and their situation can actually be exacerbated. So,
I read Russell. You're familiar with Russell Brand, the English comedian slash actor?
Yeah.
He wrote a book on the 12 steps. He went through the 12 steps too, and he wrote it from the perspective of an atheist because the 12-step program is very religious.
Yeah.
There was a point where he was talking to a counselor who said something really interesting, and he said, and I'm butchering it, but I'll do my best to paraphrase it, but something in the lines of, you know, you're very smart, Russell, to have gotten yourself addicted to the drugs and alcohol you were addicted to, because you clearly had these problems. Had you not turned to something, you might have killed yourself. So
Sure.
Oftentimes in these scenarios, you know, somebody is looking for a release or a relief or an altered state from their current pain and suffering. And so if we're not dealing with the source, and as you said, you know, you were telling these people, you got to get off everything else if we're going to give you this one drug. It is a little bit ridiculous.
It is. It is, and I see it happen time and time again. And third, they say we need some kind of plan, a strategy, so that once they're released, they can reintegrate better into society. So obviously housing, money, right? Connecting back with the community. Do they have family? Do they have social safety nets, a network that can help them? Bail, probation, parole, they should be basically developed with the individuals so that they know where they have to be, when they have to be there. They know how to keep a schedule. They know they can be reminded of it. One of the ethical issues that comes up in mental health is when you get a no-show, DNA did not attend, can the psychiatrist just say, hey, not a problem, $225, because that's what they get an hour, and they just bill? You know, they didn't show. And if you don't cancel within 24 hours, you know, well, if a person has mental health issues, do you really think they're going to remember their appointments on a weekly basis, right? Like, so it seems kind of unfair. And then the psychiatrists want to know, well, my time is very valuable. I scheduled this person in. I have a right to my money. Yep, that's a good point. You're right. But then who should pay? Does society then pay? Is that how we act? Do we say, okay, you know what? For every time a mental health person doesn't show up for an appointment, they're going to be billed and society's going to pay it? Because for all we know, that could be us or our relatives or our parents or our kids or whatever. So that, you know, it's an interesting philosophical, political question we can ask ourselves. So CAMH says, if we fail to do these things well, people with mental illness have a high rate of recidivism coming out of prison. If we do them well, there's a much lower risk than offenders without a mental health illness. So basically, good care is better for everybody. Nobody would argue that. Now, CAMH is not perfect. I'm not going to click on that, but if you want to, it'll take you to an article. Well, CAMH has lost 9 patients, so they're not perfect.
And just to specify, when you say lost, you don't mean they died. You literally mean they lost them.
They went missing.
They walked off. They
walked up. One guy got on a plane and he was in another country, and it's like, how does that happen?
Yeah.
1 or 2, yeah, sure, but 9.
It's not CAMH that you're working with, right? It's
I'm CMHA, yeah.
CMHA, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, so they're Canadian Addiction and Mental Health. I'm Canadian Mental Health Association. You think they would have mixed up their acronyms better, but
Branding.
I'm going to give you 3 personal accounts. So here's the stuff in the gut right here. So the first inmate we'll call Ayden, and I interviewed him. I know him very well. He was incarcerated for mental health related activities causing property damage, and he was considered a threat to self and others. He served his time in jail. He never had to go to prison, but he spent a lot of time there, like over a year. And he's suffering from potentially bipolar, certainly schizoid affective disorder, delusional, and that sort of thing. He was sent to Maplehurst. And do you guys know where it is? It's in Milton. If you've ever been from Toronto to Guelph, you have to pass it. It'll be on your left. It's a maximum security detention center for remanded prisoners, medium maximum for offenders sentenced less than 2 years. It's also a holding center for those awaiting trial, but it has a separate wing for minors 12 to 17 years of age, colloquially known as the Milton Hilton or Muppethurst. It's kind of a derogatory term, but that's the reality of it. So I asked him, what's going on in there? How were you treated by other inmates? He said, well, first thing I was asked, what'd you do? What are you in here for? Okay, so then what do you plan on doing once you get outside? All right, and do you want to join our gang while you're in here? There's a saying in prison, you do what you got to do to survive while you're on the inside. While you're in the inside, you got to do what you got to do to survive. And if that means joining a gang, then maybe that's what you do, because otherwise you're going to be a loner. There are also 2 rules in prison. Don't whine about why you're there, right? Nobody really wants to hear that. And don't get in anybody's face about anything. Just be cool. And if you can manage to do that, the odds are pretty good that you're not going to see too much violence. You're still going to see some, but you might not see too much. For Ayden, the major issues were, of course, violence, food, staying out of trouble. He would be eating, and a prisoner would just walk by and with his hand just grab his mashed potatoes and say, these are mine, boy. And that would be it. And there's nothing he's going to do. He's not going to fight him. He's not going to do anything. He's just going to keep eating. Because if he tries to do anything, it's not going to end well. So food is a huge factor. There's a lot of concern about food in prisons. The quality.
And they have a lot of free time, and they work out, and so those who can.
Yeah.
It is very much very primal, right?
Yeah. Like I've been in prison twice to play basketball with inmates, and they have great facilities if you want to work out, like great facilities, lots of free weights, lots of ways to get big, and you got literally nothing but time on your hands. So you want to make yourself look as formidable as possible while you're in there, so nobody's going to mess with you.
And when you compare the physical health facilities, and you compare them to, say, libraries and study facilities, what do you see, or do you have any info on that?
A little bit, as we'll see with the next person I interviewed. They were much more actively involved in that respect. So with Ayden, he was serving his time off meds, living in this delusional world of not knowing what was real and what wasn't real. And so it was not a good place to be, where he was. He says everyone does drugs. It's a holding center that creates better criminals. Like, in his opinion, that's what it was. Guys would network, and they would say, okay, when you get out, make sure you go and see this guy, and he'll set you up and whatnot. So there's how much rehab is actually being done versus is it really just a holding center that that makes criminals better. Second inmate is a good friend of mine. His name is Case. We call him Mr. K. He was incarcerated for growing cannabis. 2 places, the Don Jail and the Guelph Correctional Center. Cannabis is legal today largely because of people like Case Clevering. He was a pioneer. He lobbied governments. He grew marijuana. He considered himself a guerrilla farmer. And he thought there was no reason on this planet why people should not be able to do whatever they wanted to with cannabis. The government has no right to curtail this type of activity, and certainly not to punish people. That's being said, he was arrested on numerous occasions, and he served his time. Because of guys like Case, cannabis is now legal. So, I'm kind of appreciative that Canada had people like this. He is a pain in the ass, but he was a good one. He's the type society needed because he kept pushing and pushing harder. Why are we doing this? Why are we acting in this way? And so eventually the laws got changed, but it took a long time. And he served time he never should have. But nonetheless, here are his thoughts. Quick warning.
Before you continue, for some of our guests who don't know, Dr. DiCarlo wrote a book called How to Be a Really Good Pain in the Ass. So that's why he was pointing backwards to that particular book about being a pain in the ass.
That's right.
I've read it. It's quite funny.
Now, a bit of a warning. Some of Mr. K's quotations contain graphic language. So thanks to that neo-fascist fucker Bill the Narc Blair, better known for kettle caging G20 protesters when he ran Toronto's cops, it was common knowledge that if you did not have drugs on you when you were arrested, you would have them by the time you arrived at the Don Jail. Common policy to keep innocent people in jail. At the Don, the TV sets were fixed, so no sound other than ear-splitting white noise came out of them, a weapon used to terrorize inmates and keep them from sleeping all night long. Obviously, once morning arrived, many inmates wanted to punch someone out. Acts of violence were eagerly promoted by the corrections staff. Now, keep in mind, this is one person's. On the outside, political scum like Mike Harris used the issue of having colored TV sets inside the John as proof that inmates were being pampered, and then proclaimed such luxury needed to be stamped out by cutting back on the meager $5 a week inmates got for canteen purposes. Before the advent of super jails in Ontario, he's referring to the Harper government, places such as the OR, Ontario Reformatory, we called it the OR here in Guelph. It still exists, but it's barren and vacant. They allowed inmates to go to school. Very few did, but the opportunity was there if you persisted. Nowadays, such schooling no longer exists in our fine corporate jail networks. Thus, any inmate hoping to improve his chances of avoiding a return to life of crime is practically nil. Without any opportunity to engage in a worthwhile job, many return to a life of crime, a policy encouraged by all those feeding off the prison system trough of easy money. There is an entire substructure of cops, lawyers, and judges that feed off the ongoing prosecution of repeat offenders by quickly laying charges on all those burdened with a previous record. The objective is getting you to plea bargain for a lighter sentence, but you still have to admit guilt. Called dump trucking, this method of prosecution worked so well and was so successful that at Guelph, the prison population never fell below maximum capacity, making a mockery of the words correctional services. It's all about the turnover, not rehabilitation. If this were the US, the privatization of jails, we now know that certain judges who had invested in these jails would deliberately sentence certain people to longer sentences so he could make more money.
There was a recent story just a few years ago of the judge in the U.S. that was handing out really heavy sentences to very young offenders.
That's right.
And he was getting paid under the table for that, right?
Therein lies one of the inherent problems with privatizing prisons. You don't know who's accountable. And so if it becomes something that is in any way a moneymaker, it's going to be abused. That's human nature. So the longer we can keep it from privatization, maybe the better. So he said, that's like asking those who receive vast amounts of money for cancer research to find a cure, or expecting arms manufacturers to embrace worldwide peace treaties. Most of Canada's prison population is in jail for drug offenses, mostly for selling and using crack, at least the time when he was there in the 80s. I tried to encourage those at Guelph to switch to growing marijuana. On weekends, I would give seminars on how to do so to all those interested as a way to get out of the crack cocaine syndrome. So the guy's literally trying to do a drug rehab program by having them focus more on cannabis rather than on cocaine. I made it my mission to do so, and the inmates called me Brother Case. Missionary work from the Church of the Universe. Amen. Case actually belongs to something called the Church of the Universe. It was put together by a gentleman here in Guelph named Walter Tucker, who was the son of a judge who knew the law well, so well that he created his own religion called Church of the Universe, which he said they needed to smoke their sacred herb. So he found a loophole in disallowing cops from arresting him for smoking cannabis while in his so-called church. So that's the way he was able to, circumvent and then get around the law. So I spent most of my time at Guelph in school helping those interested in achieving at least a high school certificate. I taught them basic English, math, DOS keywords on the computer, some aspects of law, legal self-defense, habeas corpus, writing skills, and reading comprehension. Most of the correctional staff, lawyers, judges, regularly smoke or grow marijuana. They are total hypocrites and do their job for the money while openly lobbying Parliament to prevent the legalization of marijuana. This is why Trudeau gave the legalization portfolio to ex-narc Blair, who was subsequently criminalized aspects of smoking weed that wasn't criminal before. The guards at Guelph regularly asked my advice on solving problems they'd encountered with their own illegal indoor grow ops. They would gleefully bust you, though, if they found a joint on you. It's true that I did not want to leave jail when asked to do so, because I asked him, wasn't there a time when you're quite content there? He said, well, yeah, I was going to school. I was having a nice lunch. I was reading books, learning French and Russian. Friends came to visit me on weekends, and I got to save on rent money. These kind of perks helped me cope in a pleasant way while in the Guelph prison. The system gives you no survival funds when you're released, no home, no place of residence awaits you on the outside. You're just basically kicked out like a dog because it's expected that you're going to be returning real soon. That's why when you first come into the jail, they ask, when was the last time you were here? So, high recidivism rates. Here's the third personal testimony. Her name is not Pat, but we're going to call her Pat. She was a prison guard at the Guelph Correctional Institute, but also at Hamilton Wentworth. This is a kind of a nasty place known as Barton Jail. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Hamilton area, but it's a pretty tough place. I said, what's your overall opinion of the penal systems that you've worked with? And she said, well, it's a general lack of humanity. As a guard, if you act against your squad in any way, you'll be sought out and you'll be punished. You'll go out to the parking lot and your tires will be slashed. Or you'll put in for certain shifts and you will not get them. She said most, if not all, guards politically tend to lean towards the right. She calls them kind of right and narrow. Pat was a guard for 11 years in Guelph and then 2 years at Hamilton Wentworth. Now, this is something interesting that Pat noticed. She said most of the guards, she would bet, would skew heavily on the Briggs-Meyer test to be kind of an ESTJ. Essentially, this gives us the opportunity to literally make predictions. We could put forward a social science experiment in which we predict that there will be a greater than null likelihood that destructive types of profiles we'll find them more in prison guards or cops or other types of similar services. They're usually uncomfortable expressing affection and emotion to others. Most guards or cops would score basically high on the destructive end of the ISTJ. Now, this is kind of interesting. Many of you will know that there was an experiment conducted at Stanford back in the early 70s by Zimbardo, Professor Philip Zimbardo. And he used college students as test subjects. And all he did was he said, you're either going to be a guard or you're going to be a prisoner. And he just observed how their behavior evolved, being given those two definitions of profiles. And so Pat says, you know what? When it comes to guards, there seems to be a certain person drawn to it. My question for her was, is it a chicken and the egg type of scenario? Are prison guards, do they become kind of nasty, conservative, tend to look upon criminals in a derogatory way because they're like that and they're drawn to that type of position? Or does anybody just enter in to the position and they become more that way because of the associations that they make with other guards, how they see other guards treat them, and so they're conditioned culturally to be like that? I'm going to show you the trailer for the Stanford Prison Experiment, and this will give you some kind of idea.
Would you rather be a guard or a prisoner?
I don't think I have the qualities to be a guard.
Prisoner.
Prisoner, I guess.
Prisoner. Sounds like it would be a little less work.
Prisoner.
Why's that?
Nobody likes guards.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. This experiment will be an extension of my research into the effects prisons can have on human behavior.
You're going to be pleased to know that you all have been chosen to be the prison guards.
But under no circumstances whatsoever are you to physically assault the prisoners in any way. So remember, just as you were watching the prisoners, my graduate staff and I will be watching you.
All right, gentlemen, we're gonna have ourselves a lot of fun.
Rule number 1, prisoners must remain silent.
This is an exercise period.
Okay, is it just me, or are these guys taking this thing a bit too seriously?
Why don't you give me 20 push-ups?
Look at this guy. Thinks he's John Wayne or something.
You address me as Mr. Correctional Officer.
This might be an interesting 2 weeks after all.
Why don't you make up your bunk, 8612?
I did, Mr. Correctional Officer.
Well, that's not what I see.
Hey, what are you doing? It's just me now!
What was that?
You just hit him. You're not supposed to hit him.
Should we step in?
No, let the guards figure it out. Let's see where it goes.
Good evening, gentlemen. How about we make this one a night to remember?
This is all real. They won't let you go. They won't let us leave.
Those are not prisoners. Those are not subjects. Those are boys, and you are harming them.
Wait! Let me out of here! I want out! I want out now!
You thought you were gonna get some playtime in the yard, boy? Is that what you thought this was gonna be?
I had no idea it would turn out this way.
So here we have Zimbardo doing this experiment in which he took these students, essentially, and decided he was going to split them into two groups and see what happened. You know, kind of similar to the shocking experiments that had been done, in where people continue to question various subjects, and when they got the answers wrong, they would continue to shock them because this person told them that was the nature of the experiment. They had to continue. So when Pat was asked about her experience, she said things like, it was so horrible, so violent, so horrible. There were a lot of stabbings, murders, 3 suicides on my shifts. Isolation, overcrowding. If a prisoner flushed the toilet at night, he's going to get the crap beaten out of him the next day. So not a pretty picture. by any means of the prison system. She said a lot of prisoners got the short end of the IQ stick. And this relates right back to those figures we saw earlier, where we saw a high percentage of inmates with like 65% with a less than grade 8 education, and 79, I think it was, never finished high school. So this seems to be very telling of and indicative of a factor that we might want to look into a little more carefully in considering causal factors behind the determinants of crime. When asked about mental health issues, detention, incarceration, Pat estimated the population to be somewhere around 75%. That's incredibly high. We tend to put it more towards the 40 to 50%, but you know, it depends what you mean by mental health. As Cal said, in many ways, many of us suffer in various ways from mental health issues, defined broadly, but it's still quite a telling factor. And she said the reason why she thinks it's so high is because no person can experience incarceration without experiencing trauma. The whole nature of it, like you saw when I was talking about Ayden, you know, he'd be eating and a guy would just walk by and with his hand just grab stuff right off his tray. Well, you're going to see some stuff, you know, you're going to experience some stuff that you're not going to experience here in the so-called outside world. So to her, it was like, no matter how you go in, you're coming out traumatized to some degree. So what are some of the sub-conclusions, right? We know the problems are multifaceted. We know that, right? And there are many, many different issues that we could deal with. We can look at mental health, right? We can look at poverty, education. We can consider race, economics and employment, homelessness, police guard protocols, laws, court procedures. There's different ways in which we could try to figure out how to help in this respect. The basis of many problems in detention and incarceration can be traced back to theoretical foundations of justice and punishment. So I've taught courses in philosophy of punishment. And what often comes up over and over and over again in society is the distinction between paternalism and autonomy. How much freedom do we give the polis, the members of society, versus how much control, like a parent, should we have over them in telling them what they can and cannot do? I mean, this is the basis of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. I mean, some of the greatest writers in history have, you know, struggled with this distinction between how much freedom versus how much control should the state exercise. The differences between retributive versus restorative justice factor largely in this. Retribution is how much we should punish somebody for what they did. I tend to be from the restorative school of thought, which is, all right, they screwed up. Okay, according to the rules of society, they've screwed up. Okay, so what do we do now? How do we make the best case scenario out of a bad thing? And should we just punish them? Is that that's okay? So you just want revenge then? So are we on about, is this Old Testament time, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, right? Whatever happened to redemption and forgiveness, right? That's why it amazes me when certain Christian politicians, like Stephen Harper, demand so much for retributive justice. He's supposed to be a Christian, right? Turn the other cheek, you know, forgive, redeem yourself, you know, the capacity for betterment, that all seems to go out the window. Why? Because there's something innate about humans that want to get somebody, you know, when they've been wronged. And now I can sit here and I can say this as a philosopher, as an educated person. But would I feel the same way if my kid was abducted and raped and killed and cut up and put somewhere? Would I want that person to be restored back into society, or would I want to see that guy killed? I don't know. I've never been there. I hope I wouldn't. But we have to understand that we have primal urges within us. And some of those urges lean towards a paternalistic, a retributive type of mental state where that good, they got what they deserved. Did they? Have we thought about this carefully? When you look at justice circles, Aboriginal communities, when a wrong was committed, they would get all of the people together, those who were involved in the offense, and they would get the elders, and these were known as justice circles. They'd sit around and they'd try to figure out what's the best way to deal with this. And oftentimes it would lead to what's called ostracization. We're social animals. And so instead of putting a person, a night in the box like Cool Hand Luke, they would tell the person, you have to leave the tribe. You have to go away. You're going to have to survive on your own. And however many moons, full moons, was the sentence, if the person survived being on their own and could come back to the tribe, they were forgiven. And they were welcomed back as one of their own. And that's how they would deal with it. In a modern twist on that, and I know we don't have the facilities or the capacities to do this, maybe we can come up with a way to restore justice. So when certain atrocities, certain crimes, certain activities have been undertaken, maybe we can figure out just a better way to restore justice to those who have suffered, to the victims of crime, and to society in general.
One of the challenges that I find with law, at least from what I understand here in Canada, is that if the victim, even when the victim says, you know what, I've forgiven this person.
Right.
I don't believe, my religion or my belief system compels me to forgive this person, and I don't want this person to go to jail or experience punishment. I think this person will be fine. It's the legal system, and it's the punitive system. It's the system itself that says that we don't care, even though you're the victim. We don't care what you feel or think about this. This person still needs to do the time for the crime they did.
That's right.
It's a bit bizarre.
Yeah, the police can still charge a person even if the individual refrains. So it's unfortunate, right? What are we on the side of more? Punishing, punitive, or do we really want to rehabilitate people? Or is that a false dichotomy? Do we want to do both? Do you guys remember the horrible bus crash in Saskatchewan, where the hockey team was hit by a truck? So the gentleman got, I think, 6 or 8 years. Is that helping? I don't know. He screwed up. He screwed up in a huge way. He went through a stop sign. And as a result, he tore apart a community. And he killed lots of people. It was a horrible act. What is being gained by putting him away for 8 years? Will he learn from that? Well, I'll never go through a stop sign again. No. I'm not saying he doesn't need to be dealt with in some way. I'm just wondering, what is the best way to deal with a horrific situation where it's just, are we gaining? Are we gaining anything by punishing this person, by taking away their liberty? I don't know. Maybe that's the way we should do it. That, it represents to future truck drivers, if you do this, this is what will befall you. And so is it a deterrent? No, the guy probably fell asleep at the wheel, right? Or he was on his phone, or he was distracted, or who knows what the cause was. But I just don't know if any greater good comes about this by punishing that man for the horrific activity he did. He was a regular human being. He was not a monster. He's just like you and me. He was a regular human being who screwed up. So, okay, what do we do? What's the best way? He needs to deal with this. He knows he killed 15 people. He knows. How's he going to live the rest of his life knowing he did that? How is he ever going to get closure on this? I don't know. I don't know what's right. I'm not stating that I have the answers, but what I am stating is, if that were me, I'd want to do as much for that community to try to say I'm sorry for what I did. So are we there yet? Can we do that? Can we recognize that, dude, you really, really messed up, but we're going to try to get everyone through this, including you, the guy who messed up. So I don't know. I don't have the answers, but putting a person in jail for something like that, I don't know what benefit. I don't see the obvious benefits. And maybe I'm just nearsighted on this. Maybe a legal theorist could tell me could tell me better, but there just seem to be some crimes where it just seems, is this going to help the situation by doing this? Like horrific accidents that you didn't really foresee occurring. But,
I have a thought. I want to contribute.
Sure.
Perhaps the prison system or what is called the justice system is not so much about the people who have to go through the system for committing a crime, but that system is to produce a perceived benefit to society.
Right.
Who may feel safer that criminals are, taken away freedom to commit further crimes.
Yeah.
So again, the keyword here is perceived benefit.
Yeah. So it's an interesting point that you bring up, Lon. In business, and from our readings of books like Sprint or Scrum, there are concepts for things like this. They're called theater success or theater metrics, right? Or vanity metrics and theater success, which doesn't produce anything. And interestingly enough, in the business world, it's always net zero. It can't continue, but because taxpayers are paying and it's perceived, it continues, even though that there is no actual benefit or actual success of any sort.
Right. So yeah, in my mind, if I had been that truck driver, I would just devote the rest of my life towards helping that community. Like, I'm here. This is going to give me closure. I hope it in some ways it gives you folks closure, but I made a very, very bad mistake, and I want to try to figure out the best way in which I can help this community again. So, but we're not there. We're still kind of at a kind of a punitive stance. Maybe after he serves his time, there will be a chance for some type of closure in some way, but I don't know. So in terms of making a difference, PD and other people, we can volunteer, right? We can play a valuable role. We can provide assistance culturally or spiritually in various ways to make positive changes, right? Spiritual, religious care, AA or NA, education and employment, life skills training, cultural interpreter services, literacy, numeracy, discharge planning, music, leisure activities, arts and crafts, supervising low-risk probationers, assisting probation parole officers. There's many different ways how to volunteer. Here are some links that we can look at and register with. And here's the literacy program that directly takes us to their website. What levels? Well, there's a lot of moving parts. So PD needs to determine where will we have the greatest impact, right? Get a strategic plan, implement it, and then basically follow through with it. Measure the outcome. See whether we're doing greater good than harm. And in terms of time and energy, right? People have been trying to help change this system for years, and this is dependent upon, how much time PD has, how much they want to put in. We can write white papers, right? As a part of a think tank, try to sway public opinion, get them published as op-eds in some of the biggest online and newspaper sites that there are, right? At the various levels. We can provide assistance in putting together a literacy program or look at entrepreneurial programs for ex-cons. We can address the drug issue, housing issues, and we can even write to prisoners in federal penitentiaries and just humanize the whole situation and let them know we're there, we're here, we're listening to you. To finish up with a great quote from Dostoevsky, the degree of civilization in a society can be judged by entering its prisons. Another way to say it is you can judge any society by its prisons. How well they treat the rule breakers determines how humane and civilized a given society is. Thank you.